Thanks, Anne-Marie and Danielle, for that overview of RIFM's NAM strategy. Hi, everyone, and good morning. Thanks for joining. My name is Gretchen Ritacco. I'm a principal scientist at RIFM, and today I'm going to speak with you about the Creme RIFM aggregate exposure model and how we use it in our safety assessment program. A safety assessment or risk assessment can't be conducted without information on the exposure to the material. Exposure is essential to assessing risk. At RIFM, we are trying to move away from adversarial language like risk versus hazard. In truth, RIFM has always considered the hazard. The language is more explicit in the environmental endpoint, but every endpoint looks for that point of departure. We just take it further by adding in the science and the additional data of exposure, which in the end informs the risk. In the Creme RIFM aggregate exposure model, we have a powerful tool that can reliably predict consumers' exposure to fragrance materials. The Creme RIFM aggregate exposure model is a probabilistic model, which is based on real-world data from the United States, from Europe, and from Singapore populations. It considers oral, dermal, and inhalation exposures from cosmetics, from personal care products, from air care products, and from household cleaning products. The model is both flexible and customizable. This means that we're able to continuously improve the model. And later on, I'll talk about some more recent improvements that we've made. There are two kinds of surveys that we conduct to provide the data that are needed to calculate exposure. One survey provides information on how much of the fragrance ingredient is in the fragrance mixture. These are called concentration surveys. They're open to all fragrance compounders, and they're conducted about 5 times a year. All the materials in our safety assessment program have been surveyed, and now we're in the process of continually resurveying because we recognize that changes can occur, that those values are not necessarily static. So we've actually committed to resurveying all the materials at a minimum of every 5 years. The other survey is called the Consumer Product Survey, and this provides information on how much of the fragrance mixture is in the finished consumer product. As its name would suggest, it is open to consumer product companies. And again, these surveys are also done about every 5 years. So let's focus in on the fragrance ingredient within the fragrance mixture, the concentration surveys. RIFM concentration surveys are, as I said, conducted about 5 times a year, and each material is resurveyed at a minimum of every 5 years. These surveys are open to all fragrance compounders. It's important for people to respond to concentration surveys for a couple of different reasons. From RIFM's perspective, we need these data in order to complete our safety assessment. Without these data, the material get added to the not supported list, meaning that the material is not supported by a RIFM safety assessment. From the stakeholder perspective, it's important to provide their data so that their uses are counted. And this is especially important for materials where an adverse effect has been identified and we need to set a maximum acceptable concentration or a MAC level. In some cases, those MAC levels or MAC values will become IFRA standards. RIFM data provide the scientific basis for potential IFRA standards. So we use the model to set MAC values for materials where we've identified an adverse effect. Those MAC values are published in our RIFM safety assessments, and depending on how the MAC values compare to the 95th percentile use levels across all categories, MAC values may become IFRA standards. So as you can see in this slide, when the MAC level is less than 5 times the 95th percentile use level across all categories, it will become an IFRA standard. When the MAC level is greater than 5 times the 95th percentile use level across all categories, there will be no IFRA standard. But again, it's important in either case, those MAC values are published in RIFM safety assessment. RIFM safety assessments include all 7 endpoints. And if MAC levels are needed due to an adverse effect, they, again, are included within the safety assessment. And the flow chart for establishing MAC levels is provided in this slide. So reference doses from all endpoints are considered. Exposure is considered. The expert panel evaluates and concludes on MAC values, and then those MAC values are published in the RIFM safety assessment. Okay, and now let's focus in on the fragrance mixture in the consumer product. Again, this data comes from consumer product companies in our consumer product surveys. Consumer product surveys are confidential. We ask that only marketed products are included, and all product types are included. So again, cosmetics, personal care products, air care products, and household cleaning products. The model itself can capture multiple points of exposure. So we can look at the low-end user, we can look at median consumer exposure. At RIFM, we utilize the 95th percentile consumer exposure. So this would be, somebody who's like a fragrance super user. And while this is a probabilistic model, which runs hundreds of thousands of scenarios, it's still a conservative value. We're focusing on the 95th percentile exposure, so exposures of a super user of fragrance products. And by doing that, we're being conservative because in reality, many of us are not fragrance super users. And what we found, even with a focus on super users, we found that consumers' exposure to fragrance is low enough that we can often waive testing because exposures are below the threshold for toxicological concern or the TTC level. And the TTC is a level below which there's really no appreciable risk of harm. We know after years of collecting data over and over on the same materials that overall exposure does not shift greatly over time. And even if it did, we are already considering a highly conservative scenario. So we shouldn't see major changes in conclusions in our safety assessments. There would really need to be kind of an exceptional circumstance for that to happen. Okay, so the model is probabilistic. Again, it uses real-world habits and practices data. The data cover 71 product categories and 7-day use diaries of 42,000 subjects. So for every exposure value provided, hundreds of thousands of calculations were made to derive that value. The model is flexible and customizable. It's updated regularly, and recently we've made a couple of notable changes. Data from Kantar Worldwide Panel have been purchased, and the model will be updated this year with new habits and practices data. We've also added many new products. So we've added baby products, some eye products that weren't previously in the model. We've added lip balms and we've added sunscreens. And I should note that sunscreen products are those products used specifically on the whole body for sunscreen protection. So this wouldn't include something like a makeup that has a sunscreen in them. So again, the model provides the more realistic exposures, and it's really the most comprehensive of its kind. Since we have data on all fragrance materials, we were actually able to compare exposure to the threshold for toxicological concern, or TTC. And what we've learned is that consumers' exposure to fragrance materials is very low. My colleague, Dr. Isabelle Lee, will talk more about this in just a minute. Isabelle is the author of a manuscript which describes that low exposure to fragrance materials. That manuscript has been published. We are also working on a manuscript describing improvements to the model. That's underway. So I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm going to now hand it over to my colleague, Dr. Isabelle Lee. Thanks.
Thank you, Gretchen, for your introduction to the model. And I'd also like to thank you, the audience, for joining us today. My name is Isabelle Lee, and I'll be giving you a summary of a study we conducted looking at exposure to fragrance ingredients. And this study was published earlier this year. Safety assessments show that very low concentrations of fragrance are needed to impart desired scent. This is because the human nose can detect odors in many cases in parts per billion. Experimental data show that safe use levels are orders of magnitude higher than odor thresholds and current aggregate consumer exposure levels. The current study was conducted to provide measured scientific data demonstrating just how low the fragrance exposure is. The RIFM's database is the largest of its kind. As many of you know, it comprises a lot of information, including toxicological data on fragrances, flavoring, and related materials. There are approximately 3,000 fragrance ingredients in current use. 2/3 of them are discrete single chemicals, and 1/3 are natural complex substances, or NCSs. Given their importance of exposure to the safety assessment program, RIFM partnered with Creme Global to develop the aggregate exposure model, and Gretchen has provided a nice summary of that work and the model itself. So the model provides a probabilistic distribution of systemic exposure, allowing for a measurement of real-world consumer exposure to fragrance ingredients. The model covers the United States, Europe, and Singapore populations, the three main routes of exposure. It's flexible, customizable. We continually continue to add information in it. And it has various product types, including cosmetics and personal care products, air care products, household cleaning products, many others. The model has really refined the assessment of fragrance ingredients, which has resulted in a significant reduction in animal testing and overall improvement in the safety of fragrance products for the consumer. Gretchen went over and said that there was about 71 different product types that were included in the model, and here's just a summary of the details of what those are. So we have body lotion, deodorant, oral care, cosmetic styling, and these range from lipstick to hairspray, fine fragrances, shower products, moisturizers, soap, air care products, hair removal products, shaving products, the different kinds of cleansing wipes, cleaning products, dishwash, laundry products, and other cleaners such as furniture polishes and cleaning wipes. The model combines fragrance ingredient concentration data and consumers' habits and practices data to calculate aggregate exposure. And many different points of exposure can be captured in the model. So you have the lower end exposure, median exposure, and then the high end exposure. And the high end exposure is the 95th percentile consumer exposure. And this is really the exposure levels that are captured within the RIFM safety assessment, because we want to be protective of all consumers. And so we term these 95th percentile consumers as most loyal consumers or super users. So these are individuals who wake up using fragrance and go to sleep using fragrance, as you can imagine. So we conducted the study in two analyses. In the first analysis, we wanted to really compare the fragrance exposure data that we have, the aggregate exposure, to some sort of benchmark. And we needed an objective standard to gauge this exposure in a high throughput manner for an inventory of 3,000 fragrance ingredients. We have exposure data on the whole inventory. However, measured experimental data for safe use levels are available varied, and not all materials have them. So the no observed effect level would not really be a good benchmark. So there are other benchmarks, and the TTC, or the threshold of toxicological concern, is one of them. The TTC is an exposure level at which there's no appreciable risk to a given hazard. It is a practical approach used to assess the safety of substances, especially when exposure is estimated to be very low. Established TTC and practice have been derived by grouping historical experimental data from animal studies based on structural chemistry and other considerations. Since we already know that exposure to fragrance ingredients is low from comparing experimental data, NOAA, or no observed effect levels, to consumer exposure in our safety assessment program, we determined that this TTC is the appropriate gauge to use for this study. There are several TTC thresholds available. So we looked at the systemic, inhalation, and dermal thresholds. The systemic thresholds usually are used to gauge the whole body chronic exposure via the oral, dermal, and inhalation routes. And there's three different cutoffs based on these chemical classes called the Creme classes, with Creme class 1 being less restrictive than Creme class 3. And inhalation TTC was used to gauge the inhalation route, and it has similar Creme classes as the systemic, and you have Creme class 1 and Creme class 2 and 3 using their own cutoffs. And then on the dermal side, we have a similar threshold as a TTC. It's called the dermal sensitization threshold. There are three cutoffs for the DST, and we have the reactive DST, non-reactive DST, and high potency chemical DST, and this is the most restrictive. However, none of the fragrance ingredients we've assessed so far are HPC. All materials were categorized accordingly, and in this study, the NCSs, or the natural complex substances, as whole ingredients, without regard for constituents, were conservatively assigned to the more restrictive Creme class 1 or reactive DST. Defining Creme classes for each of the 800 NCS substances based on chemistry would have been quite an arduous challenge, as it would have required an evaluation of all individual components in these substances, some of which contain more than 30 discrete fragrance ingredients. However, this approach really did add some conservativeness to our study. Coming to the data, we found that 76% of the total systemic exposure in the most loyal consumers, and these are the 95th percentile consumers, fell below the TTC. This does not mean that 24% of the fragrance ingredients are safe. It just shows that the levels of exposure do fall below this TTC threshold that we decided to use for our study. And in fact, we do have some experimental data or data on read-across analogs for most of these remaining materials that show that the exposure is also within safe use limits. Another reminder is this also doesn't mean that we use the TTC to write all of our safety assessments for the 76% of the fragrance ingredients. This was just used as a gauge. As I mentioned, we have a lot of data in the RIFM inventory that we use is summarized in our safety assessment program. And then the other group is the inhalation exposure. And we found that 96% of inhalation exposure to fragrance ingredients in most of, the most loyal consumer category was below the respiratory TTC. And then we found that with the dermal sensitization, on the dermal side, looking at the dermal sensitization threshold, the DST, 51% of the fragrance ingredients in the most loyal consumers fell below that threshold. So most of the materials that were above the DST are NCSs, and these constitute about a third of the inventory, so 800 materials, which were conservatively assigned to the most, conservative DST in order to make this study comprehensive and possible. When we look at the safety assessment of NCSs based on derived exposure of constituents, we showed that individual component exposure is extremely low and the NCSs are safe under current use levels. And in the second analysis, we wanted to evaluate exposure based on product categories. And we also looked at the routes of exposure, which have been outlined in the manuscript, but not in this presentation for today. And the product categories that we looked at were the household care products, hair care products, oral care products, and personal and cosmetic products. Looking at the data, we found that exposure to fragrance ingredients was highest in cosmetic and personal care products, with the average consumer being exposed to about 10 micrograms per kilogram per day, which is about 10 parts per billion, while the most loyal consumer is exposed to about 50 micrograms per kilograms per day, or 50 parts per billion. So the average consumer exposure is about 5 times lower than what the super user or most loyal consumer is exposed to. The next category was the oral care exposure, with the average consumer being exposed to 2.5 micrograms per kilogram per day, and the most loyal consumer being exposed to 15 micrograms per kilogram per day. So the average consumer is at about 6 times lower than what the super user is exposed to. The next category was the air care exposure, with the average consumer being exposed to 1 part per billion, while the most loyal consumer being exposed to 5 parts per billion, so 5 times difference between the two groups. And we found that the lowest exposure was in household care products, which may sound counterintuitive from the conversations we've had with other people who think that exposure in household care products is really high. But as you can see here, that was not the case. The average consumer is exposed to about 4 times less than what the most loyal consumer is, at 0.05 parts per billion and 0.2 parts per billion respectively. And if you are familiar with the Creme classes, you'll see that these numbers for both the average consumer and the most loyal consumers at the 95th percentile are really way lower than the thresholds that we have for the TTCs. So this analysis shows that consumer exposure to fragrance ingredients is extremely low and within TTC limits, which are parts per billion. And these limits are also much lower than what we've seen with experimental safe use levels, typically parts per million. And so if you want access to this information, you can scan this QR code or reach out to RIFM, reach out to me with any questions regarding this work. So one more thing, once we published the low exposure paper, we wanted to spread the information, the message as broadly and clearly as possible. And we developed several communication pieces, including a video that gets the message across in a simple, non-scientific language. We are going to share that video now, But before we do, I want to encourage you to attend the Strength of Real World Exposure breakout session right after this. It's at 8:40 a.m. Eastern Time. And the RIFM's marketing and communication specialist, Olive Chan, who led the video project, will join us there, and we'll take a deeper dive into exposure and our efforts to get the message out. If you have any questions, we'll cover them there. And to access that breakout session after we close here, click the Rooms tab in the menu bar at the top of your screens and choose the Strength of Real World Exposure. And so, yeah, without further ado, let's roll the video now. And thank you for attending, everyone.
A recent study confirms how low our exposure to fragrance ingredients truly is. With our extremely sensitive sense of smell that can detect scents in parts per billion, the equivalent of a drop of water in 27,500 gallons, humans can fully enjoy a fragrance with a minuscule amount of the fragrance-producing ingredient. The peer-reviewed study was conducted by scientists from the Research Institute for Fragrance Materials, or RIFM, in collaboration with scientific modeling and data analytics company Creme Global. The study used the Creme RIFM Aggregate Exposure Model, which provides a realistic calculation of consumer exposure, or how much fragrance ingredient a person comes into contact with. To calculate exposure, the model uses measured data on the daily use of fragrance products by consumers in North America, Europe, and Asia, covering a wide range of product types. The authors examined an inventory of thousands of fragrance ingredients and compared their exposure values against scientifically recognized thresholds. Using extremely conservative threshold values, the study focused on the most loyal users of fragrance products. The study found that these top-end users have extremely low exposure to fragrances, orders of magnitude below the safe use thresholds. As part of its safety assessment program, RIFM scientists have evaluated the entire inventory of fragrance ingredients using all available study data, in addition to the safe use threshold values. RIFM's assessments show these ingredients to be safe under the current conditions of use, with a high margin of safety. And because exposures are consistently being reviewed and updated, consumers can have peace of mind when using their favorite fragrance products. RIFM is an independent, nonprofit research organization dedicated to scientific excellence, collaboration, and transparency. Much of our critical research relies on collaboration with fragrance safety stakeholders around the world. To learn more or to partner with us, visit rifm.org.